Thank you, everybody. Today we are going to do a special edition of our podcast where we have had the opportunity to speak with Atlanta regarding his current place and his thoughts on the community of Epic and how it really looks at. So I also have Travis here with us. So Night Hydra, Mango Tango, and Atlanta. Thank you guys, and I'm going to let Travis take over with starting some questioning and letting Atlanta introduce himself to all of you.
So Atlanta, that's you. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sorry. So, I'm James Worland. I go by Atlanta online, but I've top aided the last Worlds, and I also played a little bit previous to that. Also tried to compete ever since the game was in its first set, but really didn't come into my own as a player until very recently, around probably 2017. Whenever Worlds was that year was when I finally got better at the game.
I feel like it was 2000. No, I feel like it was 2017 because that seems to be where a lot of paper reports shut down.
Yeah, that was the last. Well, it wasn't the last big paper tournament. I guess there was Origins, which my team competed in, and we got a win there. But I guess overall, I've been on most of the teams that won the big events at Epic. But yeah, it's been a pretty long journey, I'd say overall. Epic's a pretty hard game, so I'm just glad to start getting some good placements and hopefully do better in the future. I've been a little disappointed at not actually making finals last couple times, but we'll get there.
Well, what was your placing in the March Invitational? Because first of all, it is an invitational. So what was your placing at the end of everything?
It was top 4. So
I mean, it would be third, but yes.
Oh, I'm just considering it top 4. I didn't realize we were going that far, but yeah, I guess it was third. But my head-to-head against the guy that would be 4th was I lost to him right beforehand, so it was a little rough. But yeah, we'll call it third. That sounds fine to me. Either way, though, it's not first. So for somebody who wants to get first every time they go in, it's always a disappointment. But it is a placement.
No, but that's a great mindset to have, is that if you're going to enter it, even if every game, when you enter the game, it's 50-50 chance of winning or losing, your skill can raise that percentage in your favor. But having that idea that you want to take the deck and you want to pilot it to a win is the kind of mindset you need to have to keep being competitive.
Right. And I would even take it a step further, that if you want to be the best, you also have to believe that you are the best. So a lot of my choices revolve around, if I'm already assuming that I'm the better player, is this the best thing that I can bring? So with that in mind, whenever I lose, I'm also assuming that I lost because I wasn't a better player, which is why losing is so disappointing to me. But and overall, I think Epic is a kind of game where if you do lose, most of the time you can point to a mistake or a misread or something like that and try to correct that in the future. So I don't know if this is a Bad Beats story time, but that is essentially the story of most tournaments, is you either get a bad beat or you get beat really bad. And in my case, I just got outplayed really hard in top 4, so always got that to look forward to whenever you get a loss.
Well, when it comes to tournaments, coming from the old Magic Gathering mindset, so my mindset is a bit off. There are people, and I'll throw myself in this list, there are pilots. I'm not very good at making decks that work to the top percentiles. I can tell you now, from having used your 2019 list, you build very well. I can play your list very well. So I would consider myself a pilot. So that's like, kind of like a second-tier citizen. I can play well. I just don't build well. When it comes to what you're known for, so I'll spoil it. It's Kark. Do you feel like you are more satisfied because you found your niche in Kark, or do you feel like you still want to keep building? Do you want to build away from Kark, or are you very satisfied with the finishes you've had with Kark?
Yeah, I think overall I'm satisfied piloting the deck. It just feels like I always have a chance to win, and that I always have a chance to play my way out of situations, and that's just an appealing aspect of the deck to me. Now, as for whether it's like the most optimal decision in bringing, probably it's probably more like I'm attached to the idea of playing it more than it is like the best decision ever. It has a lot of kind of holes, and each time I have to address the holes going into the next event in the hopes that I made the right choice. And sometimes I get punished for making the wrong deck building choice. And so it's leading me to sort of build it out as more of a toolbox type of deck lately, which is why I added Lesson Learned. But every time I bring this to an event, I always try to tweak it a little bit, see if I can head off some of the attempts to attack the deck. But overall, the least exciting part about bringing this deck is the mirror. So like, the better I do with the deck, the worse I feel about it, because then I know that the next time around I'm gonna have to run into a mirror, and the mirror is very degenerate.
I really feel like the mirror match ends up being a race to who can get to 60 first.
Right. And there's not a ton of ways for you to stop them. The first list that I brought, or the first list that I made and brought to the Invitationals last year, was more aggressive. And so in the mirror, I could at least try to cheese them out faster. But I eventually realized that building for the mirror was kind of a moot point because it's already a coin flip anyway. So if I could just strengthen other matchups, then I would be mentally okay with just checking out in the Kark mirror. Just say, whoever's got the Kark and as the life game just gets the win, and that's that. As long as I don't run into too many people that have the list, I'm fine with that. And in the last monthly, there was only one other person that brought Kark, and yep, I lost the mirror. It's one of those where I was like, well, I hope I don't meet him in the finals, because that's going to be equally degenerate. But I guess to the relief of some people who brought lists that lost to Kark, we both lost in top 4. So that was disappointing for me, but some people would have considered that a win. I don't know. Kark being the best deck wasn't always a great time for everyone. Back in the first Worlds, Kark was considered the best deck, and the tools that it had back then, previous to the bans, were very difficult to interact with. For those that aren't familiar, the Kark deck of that era had Ceasefire, which stops you from making any further attacks during that turn. And they also had Blind Faith, which removes all text from a creature. And they'd Fumble, which removes 10 power from a creature. So the combination of all of these things made it really difficult to get damage in. If you had one really big attacker to get through the Ceasefire, then they could just either remove its text if it had Breakthrough, or just jump block it, and then you wouldn't be able to make any other attacks. So you had to invest everything into one attack, if you could at all. And even if you somehow got through and you invested a ton of cards or whatever, if they casted Ceasefire that turn, they still drew 2 cards, so they were still ahead somewhere. And so playing against that deck always felt like you were losing. But after the bans, it was pretty difficult to rebuild a deck like that, because you couldn't rely on having such a difficult to interact with defensive tool. Now your defensive tools are basically board wipes, and your opponent is playing around them by just putting more pressure on you after the board wipes are done. And you usually have to cast the board wipe before your opponent casts their gold too. So you're pretty much always going to have to take a hit somewhere in order to relieve some of the pressure that's on you. Whereas before, with Ceasefire, either they tried to push a bunch of damage, but you still drew cards, or they just failed their attack that turn, and you got to advance your game plan without being interrupted. So there's definitely a lot more challenges with the more recent attempts at playing Kark. And there are a few approaches that people have tried in order to get Kark to work, and I think the thing that most of the lists have in common with they're trying to establish is a way to get ahead instead of just being behind all game. But in the list that I brought, I just decided to let myself be behind the entire game and just try to play from behind instead, because your tools from playing from behind are pretty huge also. You can gain a ton of life for 0, you can get rid of the board without having to take too much damage in return, and you can eventually get there. And your opponent's decks are usually taking considerations in other matchups, so they can't just jam like every single punish in the entire game to try to kill you like every time you spend your gold. They usually just have a bunch of cards that don't actually do anything against your game plan, and anything that says draw 2 cards is usually bad. Anything that puts a creature into play but the creature isn't attacking you that turn is usually bad. Discard isn't particularly effective against you, and I put Marcus in the deck just in case somebody did. But it's maybe less effective now because I'm not running any of the offensive backup that I used to have for Marcus. Before I was running a few Pegasus, so that if I did get ahead on the board somehow, then I could like airlift a Marcus to deal a ton of damage or something. And it was relevant in that version of the deck because I was trying to kill my opponent if the card plan failed, but I just decided it's not consistent enough to attempt to deal damage to your opponent. And if your opponent has any life gain, then you just don't really have an angle trying to be offensive. So just lean entirely back on the defensive plan and just basically try to run them out of punishes is probably the way I'd prefer to play it now.
Now, going along with that, would you look at any specific mulligan tactics as far as what cards you really don't want to see in your hand at the start of the game and you'd rather draw into?
I typically don't like seeing anything that says anything that doesn't say draw cards on it early game, because eventually you're going to get to a point in the game where either you're forced to use a lot of your board wipes as board wipes, and as a result, like a lot of your cards won't draw you cards. So early game, you still want to have a plan to get your hand size up, because a lot of the creatures that are in the deck aren't really useful early, because you're putting yourself down a card to try to get ahead on life or something like that. Like say if you kept Angel of Light, for instance. I tend to get rid of Angel of Light early game because I don't want to go down in cards until later. And instead I'd rather establish my hand size or try to get a pass back situation going in the early game where neither of us do anything is usually beneficial for me. So I just want to have things that defend me if my opponent decides to all in before I have cards in my hand. So things like Gargoyle or Drain or just general board wipes because they also draw me cards, and just try to get to a situation where I have 7 cards in hand. And then we can start filtering the hand based on what we need at that particular point in time. We also want to get through our deck fast enough so that when we get things that, like, for instance, Bodyguard or Inner Piece, we want to get through our deck fast enough so that when our opponent gets rid of Inner Piece in the graveyard, that we can still have things that are like it to replace it. Because one of the challenges of playing the deck is when your opponent nukes your graveyard, like somewhere in the middle of the game.
No, I can definitely see that, and especially in that Travis and I have played a mirror match before against each other just to see who could race there, and having those little effects of being able to throw maybe 4 or 5 damage just to keep his life total down while I'm trying to get mine up have been monumental in being able to fight against the Inner Piece, because that is really the card you're looking for to start the war.
Yeah, it's definitely one of them. Really, you're just trying to be the one that's ahead at some point. Whether you rip the inner piece early to put yourself on a 2-turn clock to win, or just to have just any sort of life lead over your opponent in the first few turns means that you're now the person that they're trying to beat. And depending on what the landscape of your hand is, you can just piece together a win just by playing really non-interactively and just trying to get to 60. And because none of our creatures really do any damage when they come into play, none of them have blitz other than Bodyguard, which usually is just blocked. But Bodyguard is probably one of the ones that's good in the mirror. Bodyguard and Brand together can sometimes force responses, and it gets you a little bit of chip damage. But other than that, you're basically just jamming life and just gonna get to 60. So I would say not a ton to it, and
Where do
I'd
you
say
feel that most
majority.
people, when they pick up a Kark list, have their first problems or first understandings where they're not really sure how they're trying to get there?
Usually, if you fall behind on cards, or like how you get into a situation where you fall behind the cards, because there are a lot of cards in the deck that don't actually they don't keep your hand size up, and they also don't help you win the game when you're behind. So Angel Light is another kind of weird one like that, where it's good when you're above 30 life, because then you're threatening Kark to win. But usually if you're playing it when you're below 30 life, you aren't actually stabilizing anywhere, because it doesn't win you bird, since it's a very small creature. It's usually not threatening any damage or anything like that. It's something that can block, and it's something that recurs inner piece without having to cast it. But it's also just one card that doesn't refill your hand size. It doesn't establish you anywhere except life. So when you're behind on life, then that card becomes less useful. Marcus is another card that's kind of awkward. If your opponent's not playing any discard and you don't have anything to banish with Marcus, he's kind of just there in your hand. It's a card that I've considered cutting, but I also don't want to run into somebody playing Thought Plucker, because Thought Plucker can attack the deck pretty hard if you don't have the right response to it, which is discarding inner piece, or basically you just have to discard one of your cards that react to a discard. But if you don't have any of those, then you're getting hit really hard, since the only answer that we have to Thought Plucker besides that is Consume. And we often don't even really want to use Consume like that. Sometimes you will, but you want to... I've had a game, now that we're on to how awkward Thought Plucker can be. I've had a game where I had to go exactly to 0 cards, or sorry, exactly to 1 card, and have Kark reveal for 0. But in order for me to do that, I had to take 1 damage from Thought Plucker so that I could use Consume on something else that did more than 1 damage. And you get put in really awkward situations like that when you run up against Thought Plucker, where you just kind of have to take it if you don't have the right things. And so that's what Marcus is for. But otherwise, you will have this Marcus sit in your hand, and you won't know what to do with it, because it doesn't gain you life. It's not really there to put you ahead on board, really. It's purely there so that you can discard the Thought Plucker, and that Thought Plucker won't farm you. But otherwise, cards like Marcus, Kark, Angel will sit in your hand, and you'll end up stacking a bunch of these in your hand as the game goes. And you have to find ways to get rid of them without putting yourself through. Whether that's drawing up the hand size and discarding them, or just playing them when the board state's not particularly bad for you. You just have to figure out ways to get some of these cards out of your hand so that you can continue your game. And I guess that would also bring up the question of, like, why are these cards even there? They can sometimes be bad. But when you're playing a deck like Kark, you tend, if you don't win instantly off of like the Kark nut draws that just get you to 60 on turn 3 or whatever, then you have to play a very long game. And as a result, you're probably playing through a majority of the cards in the deck. And at that point, you have to make use of all of these cards.
Knowing that,
So
idea, have you ever thought of, in some ways, a lot of the wins coming from Kark just come down to the timer on their end being burned up? As you have an idea where you want to play and where you want to go, where they're sitting there trying to think about how their deck is getting there.
Oh yeah, I mean the deck has a lot of time pressure advantage because a lot of the time your opponent has to think about how they're going to deal damage. But if you have Inner Peace in your hand, your piece if you're not dying, and that's definitely a powerful tool in the deck. That it has a very simple line if you have the right cards in your hand, where you can just gain life and force your opponent to react to you. Kind of similar as to how a burn deck, when it gets close to winning the game, can just start firing off burn spells, and your opponent has to think about how they're going to win the game, and they also have to think about what happens if they just have another burn spell. And so Kark does have that kind of pressure where if you just start gaining life, your opponent has to play the game very weirdly, and that can cause them to make some mistakes and cause them to take too much time to think about something, and you're just sitting there firing off in a piece.
No, and going back to like the Thought Plucker idea, are there any other cards that really lead Kark down a path where you're like, I really don't want to see this card come up against me?
I think Demonic Rising is another card that's really scary. When they have like a really big board of dudes and your only response is to board wipe it, a lot of the board wipes put tokens into play, and Demonic Rising can turn them into demons, and depending on like what the board state is at the time, it ranges from like game losingly bad to just straight up lethal. It's probably the hardest punish to the deck that there is, but that's only if you put yourself in a situation where you generate a lot of tokens for your opponent. And the other thing is, once a token-y deck gets ahead, then you always have to consider Demonic Rising, and it's not a good place to be, because a lot of the times you're hoping that you can just fire off a board wipe and that the damage that you take in response is manageable. But the Demonic Rising specifically does a ton of damage, like more than almost any other card can deal in response to a board wipe, so it's always something you have to be afraid of when you're in a matchup where your opponent. Other cards that are somewhat scary, I guess Steel Golem is kind of scary, but the thing with Steel Golem is that we have, like, every single way we have to interact with it besides Drain Essence is a board wipe, so it just kills Steel Golem. And that's kind of the advantage of, like, most things that you can put into play. If they don't have Blitz, then they usually just draw you cards or you put tokens on them, whatever. Like, a board wipe just answers that all, and you are now ahead in a very important metric, which is how you use your gold when it's, because your gold while it's your turn is a read, sort of, in the sense that you're able to play more powerful cards on your turn, opponent's turn. So leveraging that and using something that is essentially almost as powerful on turn than off turn, which is what off turn board wipes generally are, is basically saying to your opponent, okay, your turn is now over, if they spent their gold first. So we like being in positions where we can force our opponent's on-turn gold spend to be bad, because our on-turn gold spend is actually quite good, but not for the reasons that other people's on-turn gold spend is good. Our on-turn gold spend is good because we know our opponent isn't going to be able to deal that much damage in response to it. So we know we're not going to take 13 damage from a Steel Golem by playing Inner Peace on our own turn. We might take 8 damage from Hunting Raptors, but it's definitely a lot less scary than a lot of the things that can be done on turn. And usually how we lose is when our leverages their on-turn damage as hard as they possibly can for 1 gold. And some of the ways that ends up happening, big chains of zeros, where the opponent is assembling a sort of combo throughout the game. Because a lot of your cards are going to be useless in the in the Kark matchup, a lot of the times, if they can put enough pressure on you that you have to respond to them every turn, they can also shape their hand to start dealing more damage in one turn as wouldn't be able to in other matchups. They would have to use their zeros aggressively to stave off pressure or to add pressure, but in the Kark matchup, they only just want to put enough pressure on you that you can't win, so that their way of winning is like if they can play a bunch of zeros at once and put you behind more than you can ever put yourself ahead.
No, and I can definitely see how that goes, and it definitely is one of those things that when you're sitting there playing Kark, it feels like it's removing one of the base elements, and that you're not really as concerned about your opponent's threats unless they have Blitz, because it's basically like, okay, well, that's a threat I could deal with either next turn or a turn and a half later.
Right. And something I'd also add to that is that you also, like, other decks have to consider, because I think overall Epic is a game that is like decided on single turns a lot of the time, and it's because a lot of what you can do in a turn is just so backbreaking. Like if you take 13 damage from a steel golem, you're probably not winning that game. Or if you discard 3 cards to your opponent's Thought Plucker in play into you kill it into they play final task, like you're probably not winning that game. If it all resolves, or if your response to that isn't good enough. And Kark doesn't have that problem because a lot of what it does is just good enough. If I rip Inner Peace in response to a golem hitting me for 13, well, I spent like half a card and took 3 damage, and they spent a hold card and dealt 3 damage. So tends to be that you're okay with a lot of what your opponent can do in response to what you're doing. You will still be a little bit behind somewhere. The game is generally designed so that the aggressor will be ahead on one or more axis after playing their gold after you. But I like to use Inner Peace as a measuring stick for which all plays are made in the matchup, because Inner Peace is generally your best play on most turns. Because your opponent is not going to be able to deal much more damage than what Peace will heal you.
Am I coming through or no?
I did not get the last thing you said. If you said something.
Sorry, am I good now?
Yeah.
I'm literally walking around my house looking for signal. I apologize.
Oh, okay.
One of the things I have been told and have actually experienced is Kark in your discard pile is a liability versus, say, a Xanos build with Necromancer Lord, Essence Drain. Do you feel like that is arguably one of the bigger threats? Is that you mistakenly discard Kark for whatever reason, Thought Plucker, too many cards in hand, whatever? Because I literally have lost to, they stole my Kark, they were at 62 because of Xanos and Essence Drain. Is that something you have to account for, or is that just like a fluke that, I messed up one time, whatever?
I just tried to get rid of it in my graveyard. I've had that happen to me before, but I've generally been able to just get rid of it the moment it dies. I also don't ever want to play it for tempo in that matchup because it doesn't really get me anywhere unless I'm playing it for like 16 or something, where it's clearly at least going to get me ahead enough on life that it's worth playing. But the problem is that like they'll kill it on turn and they can resurrect it off turn, right? So, or rather, they kill it on my turn and then they resurrect it on their turn. Is usually the most efficient way they would have to make that win condition possible. And so, the moment they kill it on my turn, I have to be able to recycle it. But oftentimes, if I'm revealing a million cards to Kark in order to make this play where I need to use it to gain life, which is usually the only time I would ever play it besides playing it to win, is just playing it to gain more than 14 life, because no other card in your deck does that. But I'll usually be able to recycle to turn it, and it's very important that you do that. And as for the rest of how the Necromancer Lord deck functions, you have to prioritize banishing their creatures over killing. So things like Zombie Apocalypse is what I would use to draw cards, as opposed to most of the other things in the deck. Whereas we have many other ways to banish the board, and we want to make sure that we banish as much as possible, keep the graveyards clean, and just make it so they never have a way to recur the creatures in the first place.
So let me ask, of some of the top tier matchups, you have stuff like evil control / evil tokens. Obviously, the plethora of wild sage decks. I don't want to bring up mirror match because that's actually not as common as is feared. What are of the top? If you want to say like the top tier decks or the top pillar decks, which are the ones you feel you're in favor of through just playing your deck? What are the ones you really don't like seeing?
I'm not really afraid of any particular match, usually. I would say the deck's pretty resilient against basically everything. It's just that, yeah, the mirror itself is definitely like one of the only reasons why I wouldn't play the deck. But that tends to be, for my considerations, most of why I wouldn't care so much if I did have to run through mirror, just because I'm already mentally checked out. But as far as, let's say, the wild matchup or something like that, there's a lot of different ways to build wild. So sometimes you're not going to have the answer to everything, depending on what your opponent's considerations were. Like last monthly, I lost to Thunderous being resurrected in a wild deck, and I just wasn't able to deal with it because most of my responses to it are banishes, and it is unbanishable. Very awkward. But other than like weird splashes that people make in order to beat the deck, I've been pretty confident against like stock wild lists that just have your general suite of like punishments and establishing creatures. It's not really that. I wouldn't say it's like a difficult matchup to navigate. You're just usually behind. That's just how their deck works, and you just have to play from behind the whole game. And the difference, though, we'll say in the wild matchup, is that you're usually behind two of the three general metrics of the game, which is hand size, cards in like on the board, and life. You're usually behind on two of those three throughout majority. Usually it's cards and life. But if you ever get ahead on life, then you just leverage that and force your opponent to like fire off a flame strike so they lose next turn or something like that. Eventually, they just run out of flame strikes and things to do that stop you from gaining life, and you just keep casting Inner Peace or whatever, and you'll eventually just run them out of things that can actually deal damage to you. Once you get rid of their strafing dragons and their raptors and things like that, then they actually just run out of steam. So then the things like cards in hand, cards on the board, like those don't matter anymore because their cards in hand don't do anything to you anymore. And the cards on the board are going to be cards that are slow, so you can just deal with them with board wipes. But you have to be able to leverage the one advantage or whatever that one axis is that you have throughout the game and get there. Sometimes you can just rip all of your healing in the early game and is just forced to try to inefficiently deal with you. But yeah, most of the time you're just grinding them through all of their punishes. But as for the, like I say, evil control matchup, that one you have a major angle because you know that their punishment isn't going to be big enough to stop you from just going to 60. And you can generally play it the way you play the mirror, which is you just jam up to 60 life and try to kill them as fast as possible. They could make some considerations, and there are some cards that can slow you down. Xanos is one of them. It's possible that they can discard you down if you don't have the right hands. Something you have to mulligan for and play around. But those are generally the only angles that they have. And that's where cards like Marcus are actually very good, because a lot of the pressure that evil control puts on you is through tokens. So you can use Marcus to just get rid of a bunch of tokens. And it also discards a Thought Plucker. It's probably one of the better cards in the matchup. And it's also like a painful card that I had to include into the deck, but otherwise you can definitely run out of. And They want to win that way in a majority of their matchups anyway, so you don't want to give them that.
Well, speaking of, this is a very niche, but it's just one of those things I want to focus on. There are basically two kinds of games in Epic. There are ones that use timer, which is what we like to call free range. You hit new game, you hit constructed, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's the challenge, or those sorts of things. I know you answered it. I just want to hammer this home. The timer. You were talking about it being mindful of it. Do you feel like the timer is a friend or a foe to this deck in the context of, do you feel like you win better with a timer, or do you feel like you win better without the timer?
Well, none of the games in a tournament setting so far are without a timer. So we still have a timer in tournament, and in every game I have a time lead. I'm actually, this is sad to say, but I have such a time lead advantage that I'm actually kind of like playing for a high score of time lead, because I always feel like I'm ahead on time in general. Maybe just as a player, but I'm not quite sure. But there aren't a lot of situations that really like put me in the tank as much as my opponent, because they're always trying to think of ways to deal damage, whereas I'm not necessarily. Like my way of dealing damage is going to take a little bit longer in a majority, unless I have the nut hand. But if I have the nut hand, then I don't have to think about that either, because I just count up to 60. So majority of the challenge of the deck is when you don't count up to 60 and you just have to find a way to reestablish. But during those periods of time, you can just use your opponent's turn timer to think, because you're not really thinking about what's currently happening to you on the board, but they are. So they have to solve a puzzle, and you are also solving a puzzle, but you're solving a different puzzle that has a much larger scale. So you don't have to think in terms of any immediate anything, because you're just not going to take that much damage in a turn that you really have to worry about it, unless it's late in the game and your opponent has assembled some sort of combo. But when that happens, it's just going to all happen at once. Like that amount of thinking isn't like, you're not the one doing the thinking to assemble that combo, your opponent is. And there's only so much that you can think about when, with regards to how many zeros your opponent could have possibly stockpiled because of the game state. Like you could say that, okay, my opponent's drawn 30 cards. They might have a handful of zeros, but they've played no zeros. But otherwise, you're not really thinking about how much damage you could take in a turn past like 15. And if you take more than 15 damage in a turn, they probably invested a lot of resources to do so. But to roll back to your point, the whole time pressure thing, I always feel like I'm at an advantage in time pressure, because I can make routine plays to establish myself for a particular turn. Again, I'm using inner piece as the example basically every time, because you, for the most part, unless you're already super behind on board, ripping inner piece is always probably what you want to do. Sometimes you'd want to hold back on it depending on where like the turn flow or how the game is situated. Like if you're behind on board already and you are facing down a swing that is maybe more than inner piece and your opponent has a gold up, it's probably better to use something else. But let's say that your opponent's swinging for 7, then wiping that 7 damage isn't really going to get you anywhere, since you're essentially using like a board wipe as a bad version of inner piece, let's say as an example. But if you just straight up rip heal 10, if you're facing down less than 10, then it's usually just a good idea, which means you didn't have to think about that particular play. You just rip the card and whatever happens. And your opponent, meanwhile, has to think about, they get closer to 60 life, how many cards do they have, what happens when I get board wiped. They just have to think about so much more during that period of time. For just like a one turn is going to be more complicated for them every time. So you have the advantage in time pressure as you're making your routine plays, and just not, you don't have to overthink a lot of the plays, the routine plays in the deck. It gets a lot more complicated when you're behind, which could be said about most decks in Epic, but especially this one, because your way of clawing back is going to take a lot of turns.
Well, what is considered behind for Kark? Because in my head, I have the numbers, but I would rather someone more professional than I say it. I can tell you when I'm basically going to win. I can tell you what life I'm at, and I go, "Oh, I have this one," versus, "Oh, I'm going to lose." What are the numbers for you? When does behind start in your life total? When does all basically winning start for you in life total numbers?
Okay, well, it also depends on like when in the game we are, right? So like early game, if we're at 40 or 50 life, I know that my opponent probably hasn't assembled enough zeros to deal enough damage to me. I might just rip all of my life gain and go for it very early in the game, knowing that my is probably not going to have enough damage just in their natural hand, the mulligans or whatever. So we'll say that if it's turn 3 and I'm at 40 life and the board is empty, I'm probably winning that game because I somehow got to 40 life without anything bad happening. However, the flip side of that is whatever behind means. It can mean anything from I'm at 15 with a full grip, or it could also mean that I have 3 cards in hand with any life total. Because when you get low on hand size with that deck, suddenly a lot of your plays become a lot worse. It becomes harder to reveal loyalty for Angel. You might not be able to reveal Kark to win if you were to just gain life. You have to use your things that would have drawn you cards in order to stabilize, which means you're just going to fall behind on cards inevitably because your opponent has more ways of drawing cards. And it's usually going to prompt a response. So they're ahead on cards to start with, but they're also going to be ahead on cards afterwards as well. So if you ever get in a position where you're 3 cards in hand, like you're probably going to have to leverage one of your leads that you had from getting to 2 cards or 3 cards in hand and try to shift where like your position in the game. So I'm at 56 life with no Kark in hand, but 3 cards, I'm going to have to take a bunch of damage to draw back up. Because if I were to just gain life and go above 60, but I don't have Kark in hand, then nothing is going to happen. And if I try to wipe the board to retain that 56 life lead, I'm going to fall behind on cards. So you will just have to leverage the advantage you were building in order to rebuild one of the advantages that you've lost. And that can be really difficult for a newer player to grasp because you have to know where you're going to be after all that is said and done. And that has to do with what your opponent's made up. So if I trying to make a sacrifice to get back on cards, am I going to take 20 damage in response to that, or whatever the deal might be? And that is going to affect the timing of when you use your golds. Let's say I start my turn, my opponent has a creature in play. Let's say it does like 10 damage, it's pretty average, I suppose. Say that the creature does 10 damage, and I can either kill this creature now with, we'll say I have 3 cards in hand, or I can try to draw into better answers, but I have no off-turn board wipes in hand. I might just pass twice and take 10, because if I try to draw out and my hand size is low, my opponent is going to respond by putting more pressure on me because I have a low hand size. They're just going to try to force all the cards out of my hand. And if I don't have the answer, then I'm just taking more than 10 damage, and that can also be bad. But if we have a card that says spend 1 card, heal 10 life, then it also stands to reason that we also have the option to take 10 damage and draw a card. So we have to leverage things like that in order to get back in the game when we're in positions where we could just run ourselves out.
And that's, I think that's one of the hardest lessons because you obviously can easily correct me because you're more of an expert on me than this. The change in skill level between I just started playing Kark and oops, I win, and then Kark at an upper tier level is what you were talking about, which is evaluating cards versus life gain. And that really seems to be the metric for Kark because of how many cards between Inner Peace, Angel Light, whatever. 1 card should be worth about 10 life, give or take. And then your zeros are worth 5, but since they cost 0, they're just beneficiaries. Learning how to kind of manipulate the numbers I think is probably the next hard jump. And that's why some of these, in my opinion, why so many people aren't making the jump to Kark list. Because unlike Wild Sage, where once you get your opponent to 15 with Wild Sage, you just go, okay, I deal you 7 or 8 at the end of your turn. It goes to my turn. I deal you 7 or 8 again. They're dead. That's simple math. With Kark, everything constantly revolves around reevaluate. Okay, like it always feels like you're hitting the refresh key, going, I want the newest statistics. Like I need to reevaluate. I need to reevaluate. And once you get into that, it feels very smooth. But getting to that point is not the best. I've had played many players who stack things wrong, like they play out their bodyguard and then I don't kill it. They go, oh well, I was planning on you killing it so I could return to my hand. Well, then you probably shouldn't have played it. Those are all those plays that you do have to learn. You and I were talking before the show. Tell me about the zero events, or actually just the zero cost cards, the free cost cards, because in any given deck, obviously you're only allowed 1/3 of your deck to be zeros. Why the ones you picked? What? Because obviously when you can only take so many of them, everyone is precious. Why did you take the ones you have in, say, your March Invitational list?
So I did touch a little bit on how effective cards in hand are for Kark. So I'll just start with Frantic Digging because that one was one of the ones that used to be more proactive, or at least like it was one of the slots that I had changed most recently. And it was because majority of my losses came from not having enough cards or like enough ways to stabilize once I get lower on cards. And so Frantic Digging just the best zero cost way to keep your hand size up, since it is the only zero that actually has the text to draw a card on. Now, you do have to discard, so it's essentially a net of the same, but you use things like Ancient Chant to recycle in order to actually leverage its benefit immediately. And it also means that you don't have to cast Ancient Chant to draw 2 cards, which is sometimes relevant because it is the only draw 2 that just says draw 2 cards on it. So it is therefore I would say the least effective card at doing anything else. So you want to just leverage the Ancient Chants to do anything else if you can. Um, I guess we'll touch on the Gargoyle brand Bodyguard package, since that's the other sort of half of the deck that doesn't revolve around cards so much. It's more about how you get to a point where you actually can win the game. So brand plus reset is obviously very powerful. You can recur your life gain effects, and on turn you can use it to draw a card. I feel like reset is probably one of the most powerful tools in the deck. It can backfire on you depending on what your opponent has in play. You generally want to get rid of a lot of their threats before you start going for reset plays, because although getting ahead on life is very powerful, it depends on what they have to replay. Let's say you reset a Strafing Dragon, you're not actually really getting ahead at all if you bounce something like that. So it's kind of a situational card aspect. But things like Gargoyle and Bodyguard are there as sort of pseudo life gain Bodyguard because you can recall it to reveal for more to Kark, but also blocking ground threats heals you for upwards of 12 health or 14 sometimes. And both of them being ambush blockers, both Bodyguard and Gargoyle, means that your opponent can't plan around them by like pre-removing blockers or whatever. You just have them in play when you're ready to use them to essentially stop your opponent's gold spend for that turn. And Gargoyle is the most, let's say, universal tool for getting rid of pressure because it's harder to kill the zeros. There's really only a few Roxas Curse, which isn't typically run in very aggressive lists, and Siren Song, which is, again, not usually used in the most aggressive. So if you get hit by something that actually kills Gargoyle, it's usually in a matchup where you're okay with it. But in the matchups like Wilds, they don't usually have a clean way to deal with it. Fireball is not usually something Wild decks are running these days, and if they are, then they're matching up a Fireball in their deck to Second Wind in your deck, essentially. So it's not actually a good trade for them to have the card in their deck. But otherwise, Gargoyle is blocking huge amounts of airborne damage or forcing zeros out of their hands, say if they use Rage on their creature or something like that. But you want to have Gargoyle to do that because Gargoyle also recycles. So if your opponent does have a way to punch through it, then you're ahead somewhere else. So that's kind of what that package of zeros does. Then there's Consume. So this one is kind of a contested slot because this is what we're running Evil for. Or rather, we're mostly running Evil for the 1-cost things, but the 0-cost slot that we have here is, it could be a lot of different things. It could be Roxas Curse to kill zeros more efficiently. It could be Wither to deal with tokens. It could be, yeah, basically those two. Although Unquenchable Thirst once a consideration. Heinous Feast is another, like a 0-cost life gain. However, Consume ended up making the cut because in matchups where we generally don't like seeing non-good cards. I guess I'm using the epic term of good here, not the the actual term good, but we'll just say yellow cards. Whenever we're revealing for Kark, we have to consider like all the cards that aren't of his color are basically holding us back from winning the game faster. But Consume is one of the cards that actually puts ahead by 1 life in that reveal sequence because we can cast Consume instead of worrying about the fact that we can't reveal it for loyalty. So we want to use cards like that either cycle themselves out, let's say Amnesia, Digging, or can gain us more life so that every card that we could possibly reveal is just gaining. There are some exceptions to this. So Zombie Apocalypse is probably the big question mark here, actually. Was also trying to consider ways of cutting this card because we could just cut it and run more off-turn banishment instead. But the reason why we run Zombie Apocalypse is just so that we have a number of cards to run 3 Consumes with. And Consume is important for us in general because we want a way to deal with 0-cost creatures that puts us ahead somewhere when we cast it. And let's say if we were casting Wither, most of the other 0-cost creatures did something. If we Wither it, we're probably not the one that's ahead in that exchange. Because at best, we just answered a 0-cost creature. And that tends to be the most common use case of Wither is killing a 0-cost creature. Sometimes use it to kill token, which is the main reason I would want to bring it. But every other time you're using it, it's worse than. So that's why Consume ended up making the cut generally. Other cuts or other considerations for 0 as well, but because it's not good on card advantage, whereas Amnesia is, it's kind of more difficult for us to slot this card. We do care a lot about hand size in this deck. Another one that made the cut earlier in the deck's lifetime was Corpsemonger because we need reset on it to recurring gain life. But otherwise, it was kind of an aggressive creature, which was fine for us for a while. But after ditching the aggressive plan, I just decided not to use Corpsemonger as it was not actually putting me ahead enough. And then Roxas Curse is the other one, the other consideration where being able to cleanly answer some 0, but there aren't really a lot of creatures that don't die to Consume, so it ended up not making the cut either. So I guess that's all for the red zeros. But for every other 0 in the either gaining us life some way, or it's blocking an amount of damage, thereby gaining us life. So most of the other cards are for that function. And for all the Sage zeros, they're there to either gain us cards, which gains us life, since most of the cards are aimed at gaining us life, or they are directly gaining us life with Hasty Retreat. But I cut down to 1 Hasty Retreat so that I could still have the card in my deck. Because when you use it, it's typically like your most powerful play for that. You're undoing your opponent's gold. But you have to be in a state, like the game has to be in such a state that you can be okay with your opponent being super ahead of cards. So if you're both at 7 cards and you take, it's great. But if you're midway through the game, you have like 5 cards in hand, your opponent's putting pressure on you, it's not the best option to actually just rip it and try to use your very temporary board lead to try to win the game. Um, Usually it's the card that you want to use right before to set up to. So you're playing all the way up until maybe like 40 something life. You rip your life gain and you say to your opponent, okay, try to kill me. That's when you hasty retreat. So you only need one.
No, and that actually is some of the, obviously it's a very good analogy for all that. And I think what the selections show are the refinement, the changing of ideas. Because in the original, 2016 days of the game, it was okay. Well, you have to run Muse, you have to run Amnesia, and everything else is just second tier. You can see how much the game has changed in ideology, and your answers, they address very specific situations. You hate having Marcus, but at the same time, every time when Marcus actually triggers because they say Thought Plucker, and let's say they have 2 zombies, like, oh man, I'm getting maximum advantage here. I've seen that. I'm glad to hear that you actually brought up Corpse Monger, because that was in the 2019 build, and I've had mixed results with it. I very rarely do I ever attack with it, but obviously the whole point was come down, eat a card. And for mirror match, it was great. It was like, come down, hey, I'm going to eat your inner piece. But for every time I did that, yeah, I probably would have preferred, say, frantic digging 9 times out of 10 over that.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting just because, and I mean this with all due respect, Kark is kind of actually a boring tactic when you think about it, because you're just like, look, I'm going to get to this threshold, which is actually not the point of the game. It is the only alternate win con, because I've never actually seen anyone draw their deck in non-limited. I've seen people do it in limited. I've never seen one do it in constructed, just because of how many banished target players discard or they die to health loss. Kark is the only alternate win con, and I like it for the fact that it exists. I enjoy that the bans, they didn't ban Kark. They banned cards that were pushing Kark with too much of an advantage. So I feel that them keeping an alternate win con in the game is both healthy, but it also still allowed people to play Kark. The people that invested their time in learning, like yourself, in learning how to play this deck. If they just banned Kark, you'd be like, well, that was a big waste of my time learning how to play this deck. But instead, they just made it a little bit harder. So I think their experiences in other games shows, because they didn't ban the win condition of the problem. They banned the cards that were causing it to have an unfair percentage. Do you feel that's an undue analogy, or do you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, I also feel like Kark is always going to be looming on the surface for the most part, because any deck that doesn't have what Wild brings to the table as far as the aggressive game plans and the punishes, none of the other punishes are as efficient. There's some that specifically hit this deck pretty hard, like Juggernaut is one. Actually, there was a deck that I ran into a couple invitationals ago that just ran a bunch of one-cost Blitz champions that either like drew a card or just came into play with some sort of extra effect, and I just tried to play a Blitz creature every single turn and didn't really care what you were doing. Was kind of an interesting take, but I guess I got a little sidetracked there. But what I'm trying to say is like it kind of cuts off some game plans to a pretty extreme degree, and if it ever becomes a top tier deck again, then a lot of other decks won't be able to exist. For instance, Evil Control is probably one of its best matchups, and it's also a matchup where I don't know how much they can really do in terms of changing their deck composition without completely forfeiting their wild matchup. which they already have to make a lot of considerations for, since that matchup's also difficult for them. So maybe it's speaking more to how weak the control or like evil control deck is in this particular form. But in general, it means that decks like it can't really exist. And Kark was designed in sort of direct response to this evil control deck being good in Tyrants, the set before. And as a result, it's always sort of looming over control decks as a way to just completely shut you off.
But then you look at some of the previous reports, the 2016 pre-Pantheon era, the online alpha builds from 2018, 2019, where Wild Sage, I don't know how else to say it other than dominant, not in the sense of that it wins a lot, it is ever present. I mean, Wild Sage, number-wise, what would you say? 60%, 70% of the upper tier lists are probably Wild Sage derivatives?
Yeah, I would say at least 60 to 70%. And as a result, like it tends to be the deck that everybody is gunning for or has to make considerations for. It's also a deck that has a lot of flexible slots in it, which means there's always a way to make the deck better or better tuned for the particular meta that you're in. And so it'll always be there because of its flexibility. I'm pretty okay with that. And every card game tends to have a deck that always does pretty well. At worst is like going to have 50+% representation, and sometimes that can be really boring depending on how it actually plays. But I'm okay with Wild in Epic. I think that it encapsulates a lot of the basic principles of the game, and it scales with your skill very well. So it's never a deck that you feel bad about bringing to a tournament because you can always just pilot it very well. You'll win tournaments with it. And I'm totally okay with that. I'm less okay with if Kark became that deck because Kark can be very oppressive when it's good. In the very first Worlds meta, when it did have a lot of really very powerful support cards, it was very oppressive. And hopefully they don't make the same kind of mistake again. But that it's always going to be looming under a problematic archetype because of that reason. But I guess it's not really much different from any other deck that card they print. It's just this one has a very powerful win condition, and as far as we know, like something that just says gets to 60 win the game is only going to get better when they start printing better life gain tools. So I've always got to worry a little bit because there aren't a lot of other angles that they're able to take the game. So if you, or at least not that we know of right now. So if you make a deck like Kark not as good because you printed better tools for other factions, well, making Wild any better is like kind of adding more problems to the problem, I guess, if that makes sense. But yeah, I
Well, it
guess we'll
does,
have to see.
no, you're making some excellent points, and what I would dovetail off that is that, for example, let's just say the winning tier lists or whatever. Sage heavy decks seem to either be, well, let me phrase that. Sage heavy decks seem to usually be Shadow Imp based. Wild heavy, well, they're usually dragons, whether it's Draka, Strafing Dragon, T-Rex. We go down the evil, usually somewhere between Xanos or just demon tokens in general. Good heavy with a high win percentage. It's not the human token list that seem absolutely obvious. It's Kark. So, admittedly, while Kark might be, and I'm using the word boring. I'm not trying to. Don't get me wrong. Your lists have done me a lot of justice, but you don't see these massive life gain, like with Avenging Angel or Gold Dragon, stuff like that. I've seen them. I don't really have too many problems beating them unless I have a slow start and they have a fast start. Kark gives a different problem, but at the same time, with the exception of Kark, good is usually not a very popular winning tier. If you were to say a majority of your deck over half your deck has to be one faction. If it's good, it probably is Kark. Otherwise, it's some token list that gets blown out by Sage or Evil or Good or Wild. I mean, like, there's so many reasons why these token lists get blown out. And overall, I think the game is. It's just unfortunate that the poster child and probably the sole win condition of good heavy decks is Kark. Yes, it's a little boring, but at least there is no one faction that truly, exclusively wins.
Yeah, I think it's kind of funny that you mentioned the that good decks couldn't win outside of Kark, because before Kark was printed, the main deck that I played in that era was also a token deck, but it was like a Sage discard token list, but it wasn't that bad, I want to say. But the main reason between the shift, like after Uprising, for me not playing tokens now, it's actually just that Wild became so much stronger when they added things like Skaros. Although Skaros has fallen out of favor lately, like, so maybe tokens is better now. But things like Skaros for one could still blow you out, and you're just like, okay. But
Well, but you have Skaros, you have Draka, and Draka is in almost every wild list. For a little period there, like about 2 weeks, I didn't see Draka as much. You saw more Pyrosaur, but between Pyrosaur, what's the Sage one? It's not a behemoth. War Machine. Like, there seem to be a lot more answers to tokens than tokens has a big benefit. Don't get me wrong. Going wide, and you cited Demonic Rising. Absolutely. I mean, General Gyre had this Demonic Rising deck. Now, mind you, he was still, in the top listing of the tournament. It's a very interesting deck, but many token strategies are all or nothing. Either you assemble the engine and you destroy them quickly, or worse than Kark, your recovery could be absolutely stunted. You take, for example, Rax's Enforcer, which is obviously a very unique card. There aren't many champions or other sources that just sit and play and say, your team is smaller. Well, tokens being smaller is a big problem because they get advantage through numbers. And that's why for example, Brandon and I talked a few times, you don't see, say, a humans good evil deck, with Dark Leader. And yes, I that's not happening ever. But you also don't see a good wild tokens list, with wolves and humans, going side by side, justice prevails, stuff like that. Because you do have these answers that wipe out, all the board. And that's both good and bad, because it puts a challenge out there for newer players or people who want to be creative. Those options are out there. But you take that up against, say, Xanos, which has an army in a can, but it's not just an army in a can. He also drains you for life, gains the player for life. I mean, Xanos is one of those things that when Xanos is good, you just are, I mean, it's not oppressive per se, but it is a swingy card. Of all the loyalty X, I mean, Kark, you only play Kark to win, or as you said, to gain 14 life. Xanos, you can, as long as X equals probably 3 or better, Xanos is good. Skaros, very valuable. Veldon, I've seen a few times, whatever. But Xanos seems to be like the better overall answer of the Loyalty X champions. And, I'm happy when you see huge variations like this last tournament, this invitational you were in. I was happy you were playing Kark, because just from the records, you're good with Kark. So it's good to, when players specialize, like, wow, look, he made, top 4. So clearly the deck is still viable with a good pilot. But then you see some weird switches, like Magnetic had this really ridiculous 4-color aggressive deck that I both love, but I also know, why it was in lower tier. You saw Demonic Rising. You saw quite a few Wild Sage decks in different scales. But it still does kind of boil down to Wild Sage, the decks that are better against Wild Sage, and then, for lack of better terms, variations of Wild Sage. Like there's the traditional versions, then there's the variations, and then there's like everything else. So Wild Sage, unfortunately, being dominant, you have to be able to beat the deck, which good, bad, otherwise, and Kark can do it, which is why it's almost a necessary evil. I mean, that's just one of those things where, in order to keep it from being, top 8 being only Wild Sage, at least there's a gap in all of that.
Well, sure, but I also wouldn't say that Kark is even checking Wild at all. I'd say it's probably not even that great of a matchup. Just that I'm happy with the matchup. I'm just happy knowing that if the game lasts long enough, I'll win. But otherwise, like I still have to outplay them throughout the entire period of time while I'm trying to grind them out or whatever. But I guess back to the other point with other archetypes being present. It's not just Wild Sage. I think it's just because people want to try to do other things. Because if everybody just brought Wild Sage, going, okay, this deck's pretty strong, and you can pilot it to win, which is generally why most people bring it. But it's also not a particularly fun mirror. You run into where like you feel like your deck selection is going to harm you because your opponents are bringing things that you couldn't make the correct meta calls for. So, for instance, the deck that won this tournament was specifically targeting Wild, and it made the read that most players cut their off-turn board wipes in Wild specifically because they don't want to ever use them, because you don't want to put yourself in a position where you're behind as Wild ever. So as a result, a card like Steel Golem just becomes enormous because none of their cards kill the card, and almost nothing trades with it either. So when you make calls like that, then you have a huge advantage in the tournament. But it's also equally bad feeling for somebody who brought Wild to run into this deck and just get blown up. So that's, I feel like, why a lot of players are trying to find alternative solutions, or they're trying to tweak their deck in such a way that takes a completely different angle. Like I said, there was a deck with Thunderous in it, and that made finals. And yeah, card was good in his matchup against me, and it's probably good in the Wild Mirror as well. And when you make those kind of considerations, you can get pretty big payoffs. Another thing I'd like to know or like to mention is that there was a token list with Demonic Rising that won the Constructed Invitational 2 months ago or 3 months ago, January, I think it was. And when you make calls like that, where you know that people are cutting token answers, then it can still be a really strong choice in a tournament, whereas it might not be a choice in like a free play environment where you're just playing against whoever queued up whatever deck. Then you may not have a generically powerful to play if you're playing token. But certainly in a tournament, when you're expecting people to cut their situational answers because they're just not useful in the matchups that they're preparing for, you can get a pretty big lead.
No, and I think that is, you definitely are hitting the nail on the head with, preparedness for some of these events. And we cite all the time the arena or the invitational meta versus the free range meta, and the expectations. But that's why I wanted to get you on, because Kark is one of those things that it feels like it really rewards you for knowing your deck in and out. The subtle changes, like it's one of those things where if you stick with it, you do subtle changes here, like +1, -1, or when you switched out Priest for Gargoyle, those little nods could be the difference. I mean, it could be something as simple as, instead of Priest, I have Gargoyle, because I actually mistakenly recorded your list. Instead of Priest, I ran Priestess. So I had the recycle, but I wasn't getting the life instantly. But that recycle is exactly what I wanted. And then when you did the swap over to Gargoyle, I'm like, yeah, that was it. He wanted more cards. The 4 was not as much as constantly seeing those cards. There are times I've had to dig for Kark. I actually have a screenshot. I had to go to 102 before I saw Kark. Yeah. Like it just was that list. I was like, I really want more card draw. I just want to see my win con. Thank you.
Yeah, well, the other thing too with Gargoyle is that it as a surprise blocker, it's still saving you life. And in general, the majority of the punish cards are airborne. So your Strafing Dragon and your Draw, most of those are airborne. So having Gargoyle for that, just kind of a catch-all where it still blocks ground threats, but it also catches most of the airborne punishes. So, but again, like one of the main reasons for the switch is a lot of the times just for hand size consideration. You definitely want to have lots of cards in your hand with this deck, so anything lets you do that, and especially digging towards cards, since yeah, we don't have any other ways to like find Kark any faster than what we're currently doing, and sometimes you'll have games where you are just sitting waiting for Kark, and it happens. But at the same time, if you're above 60 life, your opponent is probably not winning anytime soon. So you're probably okay to just maintain that life lead until you draw a card.
No, and that definitely you've definitely been a great insight on this. I'm very happy we were able to get you because I mean I'm sure there are other people I could probably quiz on this, but you have proven that you know Kark basically in and out. And between this finish, definitely one of the things I actually would cite, and I know this is not the answer you want to hear. You not winning is actually good for the sake of Kark in the sense that you're saying, "Oh, I'm worried that this deck is going to be too big. I'm worried about the mirror match." Just staying under the radar of first place, because I've seen Tom's list quite a few times played by people who are not grasping the subtleties, or I don't even think they know that there's no board wipe. They're playing like there's a board wipe in the list, and I'm like, there's no board wipe, guys. There's no catch up. You actually have to play methodically. Whereas with Kark, it feels like it's not an underdog story, but it's just under the radar. It's always under the skin. And anyone who forgets what Kark is like, you get a solid list like yours, which is dedicated to Kark. It's not, gain a ton of life through various means, then find Kark. No, it is turbo. I'm just going to play Kark once I'm able to kill you. It's one of the fastest outright win cons besides like a pure, a very heavy wild list. And because of that, because you were in that third, fourth slot, people are ignoring that. And so for anyone who wants to pick up Kark now, I would say now's a good time to get a couple wins in, because not everyone is expecting like, oh, well, it didn't win this last invitational. No, but it's a pretty good list. I'm like, it can win. And if you take the time to learn it, it's very rewarding. I think my skill has improved by both playing your list and understanding your list, because as you said, this is one of the few lists that teaches you the value of one gold. It teaches the value of a single card. This list assigns a value. Is the one gold and the one card worth 10 life? No? Well, then I'm just going to wait. Or I'm going to draw 2 off my board wipes. Not a lot of lists are willing to pitch their board wipes to draw 2. Not a lot of them have the saturation like that. Not a lot of them are looking at the opponent's timer like a Kark list would. And I think just, you've definitely, I think you've pretty much drained dry the Kark, list. I'm very happy that you were able to, just wring this thing dry. So we have this recorded down. Especially, whenever we get Pantheon and things change up. But for right now, anyone who's listening, Kark is an investment in the game where you're going to get better at it because you are understanding an outside pillar. You're understanding something that's looking at the clock, something that's looking at card economy, something that isn't worried about damage dealt, but instead is looking at its own life total almost exclusively. It operates almost alien, and it feels rewarding when you actually get the Kark win in those grinders. The 3-turn, 4-turn wins, they're not as rewarding. I mean, they feel good, but they're not the same as when you do, 20 turns. When you go to, like, within 3 minutes of your clock expiring, some of those wins stick with you. And because of that, hearing you basically go to every aspect of this list has been phenomenal. I can't thank you enough for that. This has been absolutely awesome. Is there anything you feel like you can impart on? I don't even know what skill level. Whether it's old players, people apparently who don't listen to us. I don't know.
I guess I don't really have any like extra knowledge or anything to say particularly, but if there's anyone who wants to try playing Kark, yeah, it's a pretty good deck. But if you run into me, I'll be real sad. You don't actually like tips wise or anything. It's really just about thinking about the long game. If you're not instantly, but other than that, yeah, obviously I think Kark's a pretty good deck. But mostly just think that it's a deck that you can keep getting better at because you have to make a ton of decisions. A lot of the decisions are really easy, but the ones that aren't are really. So it's very similar to a burn deck in that regard. Really just a burn deck. And as a result, like you're going to have a lot of really easy games. You're going to have a lot of really hard games or games that you didn't think that you could win, think were winnable, where you just kind of have to get there. But it's not one where you get to rip a burn spell off the top to finish your opponent or whatever. It's really grindy. Sometimes you can rip like one loyalty worth of Kark off the top when you were one off of winning the game, but usually you weren't also probably going to win the game the following turn cycle as well. So it's like not as big of a deal, but it does have some pretty funny moments where you can just get somebody like that. I think my best so far is I was actually at 40 life and Kark revealed for 10. That was a game, but it it doesn't happen often enough to make the game feel dumb. I guess there's some card game moments where you really felt like it was just super dumb, but it usually doesn't feel that way. So pretty nice in that regard. But it also speaks more to how epic the game itself functions. You can still get hit really hard in any game of Epic for obscene amounts of damage in general, but this one seems to sort of take the edge off of it. I think that's all I really have to say about Kark. But
all right, well then I'll leave it to Brandon for the outro. I need to go separate some fights for my kids. We're getting to that rammy time of night. So Brandon, shut her down. Oh, he went all quiet on me. Brandon. Anyway, I'll try.
It's all good.
Yeah, he definitely is hiding. So, but again, thank you very much for this. I know coming out of I was. I'm very happy you were just like, oh yeah, by the way, I could do this now. I'm like, sweet, that works. That's totally cool. So when you were talking about like the Skara's gift, what do you think it needs to change? Because I read like the will and gift and all those. Basically, they're just giving Brachiosaurus to like everyone, which is good and bad. It's one of those classic things, like the same way we got the loyalty X's. Mm-hmm. What do you think needs to change for Skara's gift?
I'm not really sure if there's a lot that they can do to. It's like
we just think ban it outright, like they did for Blind Faith.
Yeah, it's like the control deck shell in general. It wouldn't be that big of a deal. You wouldn't be able to run the deck Skara's gift deck anymore, which is basically like you don't even do anything except kill creatures, and then you eventually just win by pinging them all the time. It meant that you could dedicate almost all of your to purely defensive options, and then you would eventually get there. And the win condition itself is very binary. It's like you draw the card, okay, great, you won. If you didn't, well, see you in 20 turns, hopefully. But the difference, though, is that, like, the mirrors are really bad. Like, you...
Well, but that's unfortunately, when you look at the, I hate to use the term shallow card pool, but I mean, we have to be realistic. You look at that versus Magic or many other games, the card pool is so much smaller, and there wasn't even a new set in 2019. There was a set in 2016, 2017, 2018, gap 2019 because of this app stuff. Then 2020, you know, and they only released in what, like 60 cards every time they release a set, give take. I mean, obviously, sans base set.
Yeah, I also think there's another problem with Scar's Gift, now that we're just, like, talking about that specifically, is that usually you don't give your opponent any chance to react to the card at all.
Well, but that's the whole thing, is that it's an exploit in the game. The same way, like Blind Faith, for example. If you do it right, like if you were doing Blind Faith on your turn and then following with, you know, banish everything or destroy everything, they would have no chance because of the timing window.
Well, that's kind of like, it already existed before with cards like Plentiful Dead, and I think they kind of want that in the game, but at the same time, there probably needs to be a there probably needs to be a sort of timing window where you can get rid of it. So the thing is that they would have to do some sort of, like, mechanic in order to not let you just rip the card immediately, because as it is right now, you can just resolve all your effects before passing priority, so there's no chance that the card would ever not be in your hand. So you'd have to either add, like, an extra zone for it to be there for a little bit while it's resolving or something like that. But then again, like, Epic's just not that kind of game, right? There's no such thing as a supplementary zone.
Yeah, well, but I think that's literally the exact thing they want to not do, because you look at how Magic existed. I mean, and I'm not sure. Do you actually keep up with Magic or not really?
No, I actually never played a card game in real life before playing Epic, and I had a lot of, like, really weird stumbly moments where, like, I don't know how to handle cards, I don't know how to shuffle, all that sort of shit. So it was an experience.
No, and that's good. I've been playing Magic since '99. I basically all but quit due to various reasons, mostly financial stuff.
Mm-hmm.
About every year or every 2 years maximum, they're constantly changing. Oh, well, we're inventing this mechanic or this type of stuff, or we're adding this zone. Like, the game is so changing that anyone who takes off, say, 5 years, comes back to a game they can't even recognize. Because we've played with people who, you know, stopped playing the game in, say, like 96 or 97, which would have been like 5th edition. They come in the early 2000s to play with us. And like, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm like, everything you think is actually wrong. All your timing windows are wrong. All your mechanics are wrong. They actually got rid of card types because they were invented because of this timing window, and then they were changed. And Magic is a mess. Magic is an outdated game. The only reason it sticks around is because there's a financial aspect to it. Like, you can open up a $20 or a $50 card, and you're like, oh, I'm the best player ever. You go, that's actually not skill. That's just opening packs. That's up there playing craps. You're not a really good craps player.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, go in the tub. Thank you. But to each their own. But I mean, they could ban Skylar's Gift. They could put it on a watch list. You know, I mean, but as far as adding timing windows and everything, I think you're already got problems.
Right. Well, there's no way for us to target it in hand. There's no way for us to deal with it in any other way. So I feel like it's either you have to make the card harder to cast, so, like, you'd have to banish more things in the graveyard in order to play it, or
ban it. I mean, like, they could legit just be like, look, this is such an oppressive card, it breaks the game. I'm sorry, guys, it's legal limited. Because look at Blind Faith. Blind Faith isn't even available in limited. Because, well, in limited, it was a terrible card in limited. No one ever really, like, played it.
Yeah, so they couldn't implement it. Like, they just literally didn't know how to code. That's why.
Well, because you literally would have to crack your app in half, reprogram, like, everything for this one terrible card that no one's going to play in limited is banned and constructed. So why even put the effort in? Like it really, because I think like Tom's like, yeah, this is bottom of the barrel. Like, you know, you almost never want to play it, whatever. In limited, obviously constructed different story. But
I'd say it's situational. It's just that it didn't. Honestly, the game isn't any worse for not. So that's pretty much my argument. It's just like, well, the game itself isn't any worse for not, because it really it reads zero cost blow you out, which a lot of cards do, but it's also zero cost blow you out in like a majority of situations. So it wasn't particularly healthy for the game either.
Well, it undid the game. And if you ask, you know, Magic players and everything else, what do they like the least? Most people will say counter spells or stuff that stops the game cold. And that's usually where, well, because it's just feel bad. And because why is Juggernaut good? Well, it's good because of its abilities. Well, how do they balance it? Well, they only made most of the abilities good on your turn, so half the time, whenever your opponent is over there, it's not that good. Okay. Right. Blind Faith is like, yeah, we're going to take all abilities away. Also, it's free.
Yep. I mean, it was supposed to be as a stopgap against anything particular, but it just ends up being oppressive itself. Much like counterspells are, right? It's like, oh, well, now we can print really broken, expensive stuff because you can counterspell. It's like, well, so what? That just means make a better card, then don't have to make a better counterspell for it. That's always my argument for any sort of thing like that. And yeah, Blind Faith definitely falls under that.
I mean, absolutely. And if you take it as a whole, they only had to ban 3 cards. Considering how long their game's been out for 4 years, this is the second iteration. Everything said and done, this is minimal. This is minimal bookkeeping. I mean, you look at Hearthstone or some of these other things where they have to make like emergency bans and revisions and you know, do all this stuff. This is minimal. I mean, is it pleasant? No. Okay. I mean, we'll all be the first to admit, like, oh, I was kind of counting on this card. Like, because Fumble. I would love to have Fumble in like a pure Sage deck or something like that. But as far as everything else, I can accept that Fumble's not there. I mean, I miss Ceasefire only because some of the lists that weren't abusing Ceasefire but were using it in a fair context, I like some of those lists. But if the game itself is better because Ceasefire's not there, all right, I'll take that one on the chin. You know, so it is what it is. And then for the stuff that's like coming out in Jungle, I'm looking at some of those, I'm like, all right, you guys are really stealing from Magic, but let's see where this goes for your game because the timing windows are completely different.
Right. And I think it also just allows them to give back some of the tools that they either took away or held off giving. And hopefully, whenever that set comes out, we'll see some extra archetypes. But I really just want to see if they do anything about Gift because it was oppressive in a way that no other card was. Like once you drew it, your opponent was just basically dead. Because it puts you ahead on multiple axes at the same time without costing anything.
And I know that is the problem with all those cards is when it truly costs nothing. Not that it's zero, but when you're spending a gold, you're getting it right back. You have this effect. You're just like, so it didn't cost you anything. Does that just make it a ubiquitous card? Which very few cards in Magic wow, wrong game. In Epic are ubiquitous because you have the loyalty aspect to take into account. And if it doesn't have loyalty, there aren't as many. Like even Flame Strike isn't in every list it can be in. Essence Strain isn't in every list it can be in because maybe there are other cards that synergize better.
Well, I guess it also has to do with how unique the effect is. Like I would say Amnesia is ubiquitous because
just about
just because it's the only thing that does that.
That does it to that level, yes, because you do have Heinous Feast. I understand, not quite the same, slightly different, but obviously if you had a choice between the two, almost everyone will take Amnesia first. But you started seeing this move away from caring about someone's discard. I mean, you started seeing people going, I don't even run Amnesia because I'm not concerned. Or there are wild lists out there that as they get hit by Amnesia, they shrug. They're like, you got rid of my Smash and Burn. That's the only thing they cared about, or you turned off the Reast. So, because in the early stages, obviously you had like Final Task and Army of the Apocalypse they had much stronger showings. Now it's like, well, Army of Apocalypse is good, but I still have, if you cast Army of the Apocalypse before I cast my gold, I have a 50% chance of clearing out everything you just did.
Yeah, I would say the thing that holds Army back right is just that the game got so much faster in this expansion that you just can't set up for Army anymore. Like the previous expansion is actually a pretty decent deck, and the very first set it was very good. But that was also because like the game itself was much slower, and these days like you'll just get run over because the game plans are just so much faster. Like if somebody who's playing Army against Kark, they probably just aren't getting there fast enough because they're gonna have to dump their hand in order to put pressure on you. And if you just banish their board, they can't use Army. Right?
Well,
Like
that was the way.
not even like responding to the Army at all. I'm just saying like in general they can't even cast it because there's nothing in their graveyard.
Oh no, and that's where when I was taking your 2019, I basically had a wild stage list, and then I had a Kark list, and I played this guy. I'm not sure if you know who Ice Type is, just by I don't actually know them as a person. I'm just saying I ran into them. They were running an Army of the Apocalypse list like the first 2 weeks of this real release. I had to switch to Kark to beat their list because my wild stage would get destroyed by their army. But then then the Kark list isn't quite the same versus very experienced wild stage player. So it was kind of a rock, paper, scissors shakeup that I was getting used to. And then I don't see Army at all. If I see Army, it's from people who clearly are new to the game, and they're like, oh man, look how good this card is. And you go, you didn't read the part about it not giving loyalty or triggers because it doesn't do as much as you think it does.
Well, if you dedicate your whole deck to Army, you can make that like draw you 6 cards and do all sorts of stupid shit just even because
Oh no, it absolutely will, and I cover that in one of our deck techs. I'm like, you just need to emphasize. Look, make sure you read it doesn't return every card in the same way it's in there. You don't trigger, loyalty. You don't trigger, trigger or whatever. But so you do want all these cards with blitz and everything else. Okay, fine. But yes, you build around. Building around it absolutely fantastic. The bigger difference just is when you see it, they seem just like to throw it in. And in my opinion, just like Kark, if you're going to base your deck around it, go all in. Don't go like this 50-50 thing because then you end up in these weird draws where your deck isn't ready for it or your opponent has more champions in the discard and you're just looking for your heinous feast amnesia. And meanwhile, they're beating you down with like this dragon in the air because you weren't, bargaining to fight the air.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, it's its own thing. But I'm not disappointed that the deck doesn't do as well. But at the same time, I also think that it's not as clear of a strategy, only because it basically, as you said, it has been phased out. The game has gotten faster, but that's true of almost any game. If the game itself isn't getting faster, if the game doesn't feel like it's getting power, Magic is heavily suspicious of this. Suspect rather. If you don't make the game faster, if you don't make it more interactive, people lose interest. You can't just keep playing the same base game, being like, oh, look, here's another loyalty 2, draw 1 card. But instead of a 9-3 with breakthrough, it's like a 6-4 and it's unblockable or something. I mean, like, you can only make so many variations before people want new material.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. It's just things like Army. I was just disappointed that there weren't more like it because if you take out things like Army, anything that basically what 1 gold should do for you, you just end up with a game full of 1-for-1s, which is kind of what Wild Sage is. And it is generally the best at 1-for-1ing. But like the whole game would have been like that forever if we didn't have more stuff like that. And that's why Army does well against I'd say, or at least it did. Because it just had ways to overrun their 1 gold that they spent for that turn. Right. And I just wanted to see more of that. So that's what Pantheon gave us, or at least they tried to with their like 1 gold and effects, right? It's just that so happened the only one that ended up actually seeing play for the most part was the one that killed the creature. Because the one,
Well, but you all. Well, say, but also Al Familiar also definitely changed up some a little bit. Just not in the same way Scar's Gifted. I'm not trying to pretend like Scar's Gift and Al Familiar are anywhere in the same thing. Al Familiar is definitely a step in the right direction.
yes and no. So like, I think it's only that way because you can a spell that gains you a gold, right? So
Yeah,
the reason
that's
why
correct. It has to be a
Alpha
one gold event.
So the reason why Alphamiliar made the cut in our list for our Origins for the most recent tournament is because it can get back Will of Scar. Because or is Will of Scar? Yeah, I'm pretty sure the one that the one cost gives you a gold. Otherwise, it wouldn't make the cut similar to how Corpse Taker doesn't make the cut because you're basically making a 0 cost creature into a 1 cost spell or like a 1 cost thing, and you want your 0 cost things to be 0 cost things. But for Alpha Familiar specifically, it's a 0 cost thing. I can get a 0 cost thing, so it ends up making the cut. But also, you can do a lot of really funny shit with it. But it also puts another card in the grid, which tends to be overlooked in the building of that particular list. Is one of the things we want to do with the deck. Put cards in our graveyard, and a 0 that just gives you another 0 and puts a card in the graveyard is great.